Ethan had always preferred the quiet corners of life. In classrooms filled with laughter and chatter, he kept to the back row, his notebook a shield against the noise of the world. He was gentle, reserved, and invisible to most of his peers, yet he carried inside him a yearning he could never voice. At 19, Ethan's world revolved around books, late-night music, and silent dreams that felt safer than reality. He had known for years that he was different. The realization had arrived quietly, like a secret whispered only to him. When his friends talked about crushes and girlfriends, Ethan stayed quiet, pretending to listen, nodding at the right moments while his thoughts traveled elsewhere. His desires lived in shadow, tucked away behind nervous smiles and lowered eyes. In his conservative environment, honesty carried risks he was not brave enough to face. Then came Daniel. Daniel was everything Ethan was not: confident, magnetic, and alive with a charm that filled any room he entered. He was a few years older, studying in the same college, admired by many for his easy laughter and natural warmth. To Ethan, Daniel was sunlight breaking into a life of gray. The first time they spoke, it was nothing more than a passing kindness, Daniel offering help with a project that had overwhelmed Ethan. Yet that small moment etched itself into Ethan's memory, replaying again and again in quiet hours. Their paths began crossing more often. Sometimes by accident, sometimes, Ethan suspected, by Daniel's subtle design. Each exchange was brief, small talk, shared jokes, casual remarks, but for Ethan, every word carried weight. He found himself anticipating Daniel's presence, scanning crowds for a glimpse of his face, his heart quickening when he heard his voice, and yet, Daniel was not free. Everyone knew he was in a committed relationship with Liam, a steady, dependable presence who had been at his side for years. Liam was the kind of person others trusted easily, kind, supportive, and fiercely loyal. Ethan respected him, admired him even, which only deepened the guilt that twisted inside him. His attraction to Daniel was wrong, a betrayal even in thought. Still, desire has a way of ignoring reason. Late at night, when silence filled his room, Ethan would replay the day's encounters. He would linger on Daniel's smile, the way his eyes seemed to hold attention even in the most casual of moments. Ethan told himself it was just admiration, just the longing of someone starved for affection. But the truth pressed harder with each passing week. He wanted Daniel, and wanting him was dangerous. Daniel's behavior only deepened Ethan's confusion. At times, he seemed almost too attentive. He lingered in conversations longer than necessary, asked about Ethan's interests, listened with unusual focus. There were moments, a hand brushing too close, a look held a fraction longer than polite, that sent shivers racing through Ethan's body. Were these gestures deliberate, or was his imagination inflating them into more than they were? Ethan could not be certain, but his heart clung to the possibility. The shy boy who once kept to himself now found his thoughts consumed. His studies blurred under the weight of daydreams, his nights restless with both hope and fear. He had never allowed himself to picture a future filled with love, but now the images came uninvited, painted with Daniel's face. Still, guilt accompanied every fantasy. He would picture Liam's trusting eyes, the comfort between him and Daniel, and Ethan would feel like an intruder trespassing into a life that was not his to claim. That awareness kept him silent, even as his longing grew unbearable. It was during one ordinary afternoon, when Daniel sat across from him in the library, that Ethan realized he was standing at the edge of something he could not escape. Their conversation was simple, nothing extraordinary, discussing an assignment, exchanging quiet laughter, but when Daniel's hand brushed against his, the world seemed to pause. Neither of them moved immediately, neither pulled away, and in that suspended moment, Ethan felt both terrified and alive. When Daniel finally withdrew, the air between them felt charged, fragile, as though both had recognized something they could no longer deny. Ethan gathered his books with trembling hands, his mind spinning, his heart racing. For the first time, he wondered not if, but when the line between them would blur. That night, lying awake in the dark, Ethan admitted to himself a truth he had tried to bury: this was no longer a harmless crush. It was a forbidden desire, a hunger that could shatter the fragile peace of 3 lives. And though fear pressed heavily against him, another feeling rose quietly, one he could not ignore: hope. The story of the shy boy was no longer about longing in silence. It was about to become something riskier, something dangerous, something he both dreaded and craved. The days following that moment in the library felt different, as though the air itself had thickened between Ethan and Daniel. Neither spoke of the brush of hands, but silence carried its own language. Every time their eyes met, Ethan felt a pull, something unspoken drawing him closer, daring him to step across a line he had always sworn he would never cross. Daniel began appearing more frequently in his life. Sometimes he would slide into the seat beside Ethan in class, other times he would seek him out in the cafeteria, brushing off questions from others with casual ease. To anyone watching, it looked like friendship. But to Ethan, it was something more, an intimacy wrapped in ordinary moments, each encounter feeding the quiet storm that swelled inside him. One evening, after study group, Daniel suggested walking Ethan home. The streets were quiet, bathed in the dim glow of streetlights, the world around them hushed except for the soft rhythm of their footsteps. Their conversation meandered, light at first, until Daniel asked a question that stopped Ethan's breath. Do you ever feel like you're hiding who you are? Ethan hesitated, his throat tight, unsure if the words he longed to say would betray him. Daniel's gaze lingered, patient yet searching, and in that look Ethan recognized something terrifyingly familiar: recognition. For the first time, he felt seen, not for the mask he wore, but for the truth he had buried. That he nodded, unable to say more, and Daniel's slight smile in return was enough to send a tremor through him. That night, Ethan lay awake replaying the exchange, every detail magnified, until the truth was undeniable. Daniel understood, their connection deepened in subtle, dangerous ways. Daniel began confiding in Ethan, speaking of frustrations, dreams, and even the strains of his relationship with Liam. Ethan listened, torn between sympathy and selfish relief, each confession widening the space where desire could grow. He knew it was wrong to take comfort in Daniel's doubts, yet he clung to them, desperate for anything that made his feelings less impossible. The turning point arrived on a rainy afternoon. Ethan had stayed late at the library, and as he stepped outside, the downpour caught him unprepared. Daniel appeared from nowhere, umbrella in hand, laughing as he pulled Ethan under its shelter. They walked pressed close, shoulders brushing, their laughter swallowed by the storm. When the rain grew heavier, they ducked beneath a nearby awning, water dripping from their hair, their breaths coming fast. Ethan looked at Daniel, and Daniel looked back. The world narrowed to that single instant. There were no words, no explanations, just the inevitable. Daniel leaned closer, and before Ethan could think to resist, their lips met. That it was brief, almost tentative, yet it carried the weight of every unspoken longing, every restless night, every moment of restraint. Ethan's heart pounded, his mind screaming of betrayal, of Liam, of consequences, yet his body betrayed him with its hunger for more. When they pulled apart, silence returned, heavy and charged. Daniel's expression flickered between conflict and desire, but he didn't step away. Instead, he whispered, "We shouldn't, but I can't stop thinking about you." Ethan's breath caught. Those words, forbidden as they were, felt like a lifeline he had waited his whole life to hear. And yet, beneath the thrill, guilt coiled tight in his chest. From that moment forward, secrecy became their language. They found excuses to meet, study sessions that lasted too long, walks that strayed off familiar paths, moments stolen in shadows where no one else could see. Each touch, each kiss, carried both exhilaration and dread. Ethan, once invisible, now felt alive in a way he had never imagined, yet every step deeper bound him tighter to a web of lies. Daniel was careful, cautious when others were near, but in private he allowed the walls to fall. Ethan discovered a tenderness in him that felt intoxicating, a vulnerability hidden beneath his confident exterior. Yet, always, the shadow of Liam lingered. The thought of him waiting, trusting, loving without suspicion, gnawed at Ethan, even as he surrendered to moments that felt too precious to resist. With every meeting, Ethan's transformation grew sharper. He was no longer simply the shy boy on the margins, he was bold in stolen moments, daring enough to risk heartbreak for fleeting happiness. But with boldness came a mounting fear. How long could they continue before someone noticed? How long before the world they were hiding from came crashing in? The secrecy that once thrilled him began to feel fragile, a glass wall threatening to shatter at the slightest touch. Yet when Daniel reached for his hand in those hidden hours, Ethan pushed the fear aside. He chose desire, even knowing it carried a cost he was not yet prepared to face, and so the line was crossed, not once, but many times, until the boundary between right and wrong blurred into something Ethan no longer dared to define. What had begun as a quiet admiration had become a dangerous truth, one that would not remain hidden forever. Secrets have a way of slipping into the open. For weeks, Ethan and Daniel lived in a fragile world of stolen moments and whispered promises, each encounter a mixture of sweetness and dread. They convinced themselves that no one noticed, that their quiet betrayals could remain invisible. But lies leave trails, and soon, Liam began to see what they had tried so carefully to conceal. That it started with small things: Daniel's distracted gaze, his sudden absences, the way his phone seemed to linger too long in his hand. Liam, ever patient and trusting, at first brushed it aside. But suspicion is like a crack in glass: once formed, it only spreads. One evening, he confronted Daniel, his voice trembling not with anger, but with hurt. "Is there someone else?" Daniel faltered. For the first time in Ethan's memory, his confidence deserted him. He denied nothing, offered no excuses. Silence answered the question more loudly than words. Liam's eyes hardened, and the bond that had once seemed unshakable fractured before them. When Ethan learned of the confrontation, his stomach turned to stone. The safety of secrecy had evaporated. He imagined Liam's pain, the betrayal etched into his face, and shame consumed him. He had long feared being invisible, but in this moment, he wished for nothing more than to disappear. Daniel reached for Ethan, whispering reassurances, insisting that what they had was real, that it mattered. Yet even in Daniel's arms, Ethan felt the weight of guilt pressing down. What was love worth if it was built upon someone else's heartbreak? The sweetness of their affair now tasted bitter. The fallout was swift. Word spread through their circle, whispers weaving stories faster than truths could catch them. Friends who once greeted Ethan with warmth now looked at him with judgment, their eyes sharp with questions they never dared to speak aloud. He became both visible and exposed, his secret no longer a hidden treasure but a public scar. Daniel tried to shield him, but even Daniel seemed torn, caught between the wreckage of his bond with Liam and the fragile new connection with Ethan. Arguments replaced laughter, silences stretched longer, and what had once felt intoxicating now felt suffocating. Ethan, once so desperate to be seen, began to wonder if being invisible had been safer after all. The breaking point came late one night. They sat together in Daniel's apartment, the room heavy with unspoken words. Daniel's face was drawn, his voice hoarse when he finally said, "I don't know if I can fix this." Liam deserved better. You deserved honesty. And I? He stopped, unable to finish, the weight of his choices pressing down on him. Ethan listened, his heart aching, yet strangely calm. For the first time, he saw Daniel not as the flawless figure he had idolized, but as a man flawed, torn, and uncertain. The realization cut deep: his forbidden love had been real, but it was not enough to withstand the damage it had caused. Tears came quietly, not in anger, but in sorrow. Ethan understood then that love could be both a gift and a weapon, capable of lifting hearts or breaking them beyond repair. He rose from the couch, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. "I think I need to walk away." Daniel didn't stop him. Perhaps he knew it was the only choice left. Ethan stepped into the night, the air cool against his skin, the city alive around him in ways he had never noticed before. He felt both broken and strangely free. The shy boy who once hid in shadows had stepped into a truth that was messy, painful, and real. And though it had ended in heartbreak, it had also carved out a space inside him where courage could grow. In the days that followed, Ethan walked alone, replaying everything that had happened. He thought of Daniel's smile, Liam's trust, his own reckless hope. He carried the guilt, but he also carried the lesson, that secrecy and betrayal may ignite passion, but they leave scars that take far longer to heal than moments of pleasure last. And yet, beneath the sorrow, a quiet strength took root. Ethan had faced desire, temptation, and consequence. He had loved, even if wrongly, and survived its fallout. For the first time, he did not feel invisible, not because of Daniel, not because of anyone else, but because he had seen himself. The story was not one of triumph, nor of simple romance. It was a story of longing, of choices made in weakness, and of the strength that comes from facing their aftermath. Ethan's heart still ached, but it beat with a new rhythm, one that promised he would not always be defined by mistakes, but by the growth that followed them. The boy who once lived in silence had found his voice, even if it came through heartbreak. And that, he realized, was its own beginning. In the weeks after Ethan walked away from Daniel, silence became his companion once more. Yet this silence was different from the one he had known before Daniel. It was heavier, carrying with it the echoes of things said and unsaid, of choices made and lives disrupted. He often replayed the past months in his mind, as though combing through the ashes of a fire, searching for meaning among the ruins. For the first time in his life, Ethan was forced to face himself without illusion. He could no longer pretend that he was merely a quiet boy on the sidelines, untouched by desire or consequence. He had stepped into passion, had tasted love wrapped in secrecy, and now bore the weight of betrayal on his shoulders. The experience had burned away the innocence he once carried. In its place was something sharper, more complex, a painful awareness of how fragile trust could be. Though Daniel reached out a few times, sending messages that hovered between apology and longing, Ethan did not respond. His silence was not born of anger, but of necessity. To answer would be to reopen a wound that needed time to close. Yet even as he ignored Daniel's words, his heart betrayed him with a pang each time he saw the name flash across his screen. Love, he realized, does not vanish simply because it should. Life outside his emotions moved forward with relentless pace. At college, classmates whispered less as the weeks passed, their curiosity fading, their attention turning elsewhere. Ethan was left with the strange freedom of being forgotten, a freedom that felt both relieving and isolating. The shadows returned, but this time he no longer sought to hide within them. Instead, he began to use the solitude to rebuild himself. He threw himself into his studies, finding comfort in the clarity of tasks with definite answers, unlike the tangle of his personal life. He spent long hours in the library, not waiting for Daniel this time, but searching for stability in knowledge and routine. Slowly, he began to regain a sense of control, yet at night, when the world grew quiet, memories crept back. The laughter he shared with Daniel, the warmth of his touch, the sweetness of forbidden kisses, they haunted him, not as regrets, but as reminders of a version of himself that had been awakened. He could not undo what had happened, nor could he erase the part of himself that had learned to crave closeness. It was in those nights of reflection that Ethan began to write. At first, it was scattered sentences, fragments of thoughts scribbled into a worn notebook. But soon, his words grew into pages, stories of love, of mistakes, of longing. He wrote not to forget Daniel, but to understand him, to understand himself, and to give shape to the emotions that threatened to overwhelm him. Writing became both confession and release, a way to carry his truths without the need for secrecy. Weeks turned into months, and slowly, Ethan's pain shifted into resilience. He no longer flinched when Daniel's name appeared on his phone. He no longer avoided Liam's gaze in passing. Instead, he learned to meet both the past and present with a quiet strength that surprised even himself. The scars remained, but they no longer defined him. One afternoon, while sitting alone in a cafe, Ethan noticed someone watching him from across the room. The stranger offered a brief, kind smile before looking away. It was nothing, an ordinary exchange, the kind that fills countless days unnoticed. Yet to Ethan, it sparked something, a reminder that life continued, that new stories awaited him, that love could exist beyond what had been lost. That he closed his notebook and allowed himself a small smile in return. For the first time since Daniel, the future did not terrify him. It was uncertain, yes, but it held possibility. And possibility was enough. As he left the cafe, the evening sun cast a warm glow across the streets, and Ethan walked forward with steady steps. The shy boy who once hid in shadows had been broken, but in being broken, he had discovered something invaluable, the strength to begin again. This was not the end of his story. It was the beginning of another.